Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. At dawn, the ranch smelled of sage and defiance. I was feeding a newborn foal when the HOA queen rolled up in her SUV, clipboard in hand, ready for war. She didn't know it yet, but crossing my fence was the worst and last mistake she'd ever make. Welcome to Red Rock Hollow. There's something sacred about morning air on a ranch. It smells of sagebrush, leather, and old promises. By 6, the sun was barely cresting the edge of the hills, bleeding gold across the red dust of my land. I was elbow-deep in hay and sweat, coaxing a stubborn mare into her new foal's pen when I caught a glimpse of the subdivision beyond my southern fence. A tidy cluster of beige homes with identical roofs and desperate lawns, creeping closer every year like a mold I couldn't scrub off. They called it Sundown Pines, a planned community. A manufactured haven for people who wanted the illusion of rural life without the inconvenience of actual animals, dirt, or reality. And lording over that illusion with an iron clipboard was Karen Slocum. I met Karen 2 years ago when she drove up my private road like she owned it, stepped out of her Lexus in kitten heels, and tried to convince me that donating 5 acres of Red Rock Hollow to the HOA for a communal park would elevate property values for everyone. I told her what I tell most people who try to tell me what to do with my land. No. She didn't take it well. Since then, it had been war by passive aggression. She called the county to complain about the odor of livestock waste, the excessive dust from training activities, and even the visual obstruction of her residents' sunsets. Sunset. As if my barn had blocked the sun itself. I stopped answering her emails after she accused one of my horses of hostile posture from behind the fence. I'd hoped it would die down with time. People get bored. They find new crusades. But not Karen. She saw my refusal as a personal betrayal, a stand against her vision of HOA utopia. I made it a point to keep everything about Red Rock Hollow clean and legal. My deeds were ironclad. My land was zoned for livestock and agricultural use long before Sundown Pines existed. I kept the fences maintained, noise levels down, and manure properly composted. But I also made it very clear that I didn't take orders from any HOA or their clipboard queen. I even had a carved wooden sign at the entrance, Private Ranch. Not affiliated with any HOA. Trespassers will be fed to the horses. Just kidding. Mostly. Still, every few months, some petty complaint would find its way to my mailbox or the county clerk's office. Karen was nothing if not persistent. But lately, I felt the tension rising, the way she glared when we passed each other at the feed store. The HOA newsletter that featured an article titled "Dealing with Aggressive Border Neighbors" that, despite no names, might as well have said, "That dirtbag cowboy next door." I started noticing unfamiliar vehicles driving slow along my fence line, taking pictures. HOA staffers, probably. I knew they were sniffing for something, some crack in the armor they could exploit. And if they couldn't find one, they'd invent it. So I wasn't surprised when it finally came to a head. But I'll admit, I wasn't expecting it to be quite so theatrical. It started with the crunch of tires on gravel. I was elbow-deep in the foaling stall, coaxing a first-timer to nurse while keeping one eye on her back legs. She was nervous and big as a truck, so my focus was entirely on keeping her calm. But the sound of an engine creeping up my driveway, followed by the unmistakable slam of car doors, broke my concentration like a gunshot. I wiped the sweat off my brow, peeked out of the barn, and there it was. A gleaming white SUV with a Sundown Pines HOA logo slapped across the side like it was the damn sheriff's office. 3 people stood around it like they were about to breach a meth lab. One of them was Karen Slocum, arms crossed, sunglasses perched like a hawk's visor, staring at my ranch like she was auditing a war crime. With her were 2 men, mid-30s, stiff postures, matching polo shirts that read Community Environmental Oversight Division in bold green letters. What a joke. I walked up, wiping my hands on a rag, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're a long way from your playground, Karen. What's the occasion?" "We've received multiple complaints," she said in that clipped HOA queen tone. "Odors, unsafe animal enclosures, unsanitary waste disposal. We're conducting a mandatory field inspection under Section 7 of our Community Health Code." I laughed. I couldn't help it. Community Health Code. Karen, this isn't your community. This is private property. I'm not part of your HOA. You don't have jurisdiction over a damn square inch of this ranch. That's debatable, she snapped. We believe a portion of your southern paddock may fall within the HOA's zone of concern. Zone of concern? I raised an eyebrow. Is that before or after the Twilight Sparkle initiative? The two men didn't laugh. One of them had already started taking photos of my barn from the driveway. The other moved toward the fence line like he owned the place. Whoa, I said, stepping forward. You step 1 foot past that fence without a court order and you're trespassing. Karen just smiled. We're simply performing an observational sweep. I turned to go get my phone, have to call the sheriff, have to get this nonsense on video. But before I could take 2 steps, I heard the unmistakable clink of someone climbing the old corral fence. I turned in time to see both of the so-called inspectors drop into my main training paddock, the one where 4 of my horses were out on supervised free time, including Rush. Rush was a young stallion, recently started under saddle, big, smart, and proud. He didn't like strangers, especially ones who moved fast, wore sunglasses, and smelled like hand sanitizer and cheap cologne. The second the first guy's boot hit the sandy soil of the paddock, Rush's ears snapped forward, his nostrils flared. He gave a sharp, aggressive snort that echoed like thunder, then started to trot sideways in that signature high-stepping, tail-flagging way that always made me think he was about to audition for a Roman chariot scene. "Don't run," I called out, half smirking as I hit record on my phone. "Seriously, do not run." They ran. The moment the first man flinched and turned, Rush took it as a game. He charged, not to trample, not to hurt, but to assert his territory the way any dominant stallion would. Dust flew. One of the men screamed, actually screamed, as he tripped over a rail, then flopped into the sand like a fish. The other made it halfway up the fence, only for his pants to catch on a splintered board and rip from knee to hip. Karen, meanwhile, was yelling something about liability and legal action. She tried to step back from the fence, tripped over my wheelbarrow, and landed flat on her back in a compost pile I'd been rotating for 2 weeks. When she stood up, she was covered shoulder to shoe in a blend of horse manure, decomposed alfalfa, and her own shattered dignity. I kept filming. "Care for a scoop?" I asked, holding out a pitchfork like a waiter offering a dessert menu. "You will regret this," she bellowed, pointing a trembling sunroof-covered finger at me. "This isn't over." "No," I agreed, grinning. "It really, really isn't." The 3 of them limped, slid, and scrambled back into the SUV. One left behind a shoe. Another dropped his clipboard, which was already half-eaten by Dusty, my barn goat. They peeled out in reverse, dust flying, a perfect trail of humiliation leading back to their precious subdivision. I turned off the camera, whistled for Rush, and scratched his neck as he cooled off. "Good boy," I said. "You just saved me a whole lot of trouble." Little did I know, the real trouble was still brewing. By the next morning, I'd mostly written the incident off as just another day of HOA nonsense, albeit a particularly glorious one. Rush got an extra apple. Karen probably got a long, shame-soaked shower. I uploaded the video to a private backup drive, poured myself a stiff coffee, and went back to the rhythm of ranch life. That piece lasted exactly until noon. I was restacking hay bales near the main barn when a white pickup rolled up the drive. Not Karen's crowd this time, but a courier. He handed me a flat envelope and had the gall to offer a tight little smile as if delivering a birthday card. I opened it right there on the fence post. Summons. HOA Sundown Pines was officially suing me. The list of charges was the kind of creative fiction you'd expect from someone who once accused a horse of staring with malicious intent. Creation of a dangerous environment. Obstruction of a community safety inspection. Failure to comply with local oversight. Endangering public health via hostile animal behavior, and my personal favorite, emotional damages resulting from negligent equestrian containment. I laughed so hard I choked on my coffee. They were asking for $250,000 in damages. Not only that, but they wanted a court injunction barring me from keeping more than 2 horses on my property until a community-approved inspection process could be established. I'd seen plenty of spite in my time, but this was delusion dressed up as legal paperwork. I called Nina Holtz immediately. Nina wasn't just my attorney. She was a wildfire in a suit. Former assistant AG for Maricopa County, turned independent counsel for landowners and agricultural rights. She once made a corporate developer cry during deposition, and the video is still passed around rancher circles as bedtime inspiration. She didn't even pretend to be surprised. She's testing the boundaries, Nina said, literally and figuratively. You embarrassed her, so now she's trying to bury you under paper instead of compost. She picked the wrong soil, I said. What's our move? Counterclaim, trespassing, defamation, malicious prosecution. If we're lucky, maybe even attempted annexation. Did you say you got video? Oh, I got video, I said, already transferring the files to her drive. You want the slow-motion replay of the manure splash or just the full reel? That depends, Nina said dryly. Do we want the judge to laugh or cry? By the time the sun dipped behind the red rocks, we had the paperwork for a formal countersuit ready to file. Nina moved fast, she always did, and before midnight, we had an email confirmation from the county court accepting our motion. But the real fun started the next morning. Nina posted the video on a private server she used for press kits and emailed it to 3 local agricultural coalitions and a couple of old contacts in the regional press. I didn't even know she'd done it until my phone started buzzing with messages from friends, neighbors, and people I hadn't seen since I got out of the Army. By lunchtime, the footage had gone viral in every horse owner Facebook group in Arizona. Memes exploded. Someone edited dramatic music over Karen falling into the compost. Another one looped the "You will regret this" scream into a techno remix titled Manure Drop. But it wasn't just jokes. Local papers started calling. One ran the headline, HOA President Charges Rancher Gets Charged by Horse Instead. My inbox flooded with support. Ranchers, property owners, people who'd been bullied by HOAs just like this one. The County Agriculture Board even sent a thank you note for highlighting the importance of property boundaries and livestock safety. Karen, she doubled down. She called into a morning radio show claiming I had trained the horse to attack civilians, that I was militant, and that my property was a menace to the suburban ideal. Suburban ideal. If I wasn't already motivated to take this all the way to court, I sure as hell was now. I knew Karen wasn't going to take this quietly. She'd tasted public humiliation and responded the only way tyrants do, by doubling down. What I didn't expect was how far she was willing to go to pretend she had the right to crawl over my fence in the first place. It started when Nina got an email from HOA's counsel, a smug, over-polished guy named Bradford Teeley, who wrote like a man who practiced arguments in the mirror. Attached to the email was a PDF of what he called updated boundary records, with highlighted sections of my southern paddock marked as Shared Community Buffer Zone. I stared at the map for a long time. It looked official, on county seal, parcel numbers, all the bells and whistles, but I knew damn well what I owned. Every acre of Red Rock Hollow had been in my family for decades. I'd inherited it clean, paid off every tax, recorded every survey. There was no HOA easement, no buffer zone, no nothing. Nina had already run the plat through a verification program. It's doctored, she said flatly. They used the old preliminary district overlay from when Sundown Pines was proposed and photoshopped it to make it look like your paddock was partially within their governance zone. It's a terrible fake. Wrong fonts, wrong seal size. But to someone less familiar with land records, it might look real enough. They're manufacturing evidence? They're trying to, she said. And that's a whole new level of stupid. By that evening, Nina had contacted the county recorder's office. We requested the original plat maps, parcel filings, and geographic overlays. She even had a GIS specialist analyze satellite data from the last 10 years to show fence lines hadn't changed since long before Sundown Pines was a twinkle in Karen's little HOA eye. I was angry, not the hot, yelling kind of angry, the cold kind. The kind that comes from knowing someone looked at a piece of land your father died trying to keep and said, I think I'll just lie it into mine. We didn't wait. Nina filed an emergency motion to bar the HOA from submitting any further documents in court until a forensic audit of their filings could be completed. She included a sworn statement from the county zoning office declaring no overlap between Red Rock Hollow and any HOA jurisdiction, past or present. The court took it seriously. The judge issued a warning. If it turned out the documents were fabricated, the HOA could face sanctions. Teeley went quiet. Karen, not so much. She held an emergency HOA meeting that night. Of course, someone recorded it, an elderly couple 2 blocks from the ranch who were sick of her antics. They sent us the footage. It showed Karen pacing at the front of the community hall, voice tight with fury, claiming that boundaries are fluid, that private landowners are obstacles to community growth, and that I was a rogue element. Someone in the crowd asked if the map they had circulated was official. Karen hesitated. "It's in review," she said. "Not a good look." The footage made it into our hands just in time for the next hearing. We walked into the courthouse with binders full of maps, timestamps, survey records, and that video queued up on Nina's tablet. The judge, a lean, no-nonsense woman with a look like she'd wrangled her share of HOA nonsense, watched the footage in stony silence. Then she looked at the HOA's counsel. "Mr. Teely," she said, "you submitted these boundary documents to this court. Are you prepared to attest to their accuracy under penalty of perjury?" His mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I will need to confer with my client," he said finally. The judge nodded. "You'll do more than that. You'll have 48 hours to either verify every claim in these documents or withdraw them entirely. If I find you've knowingly submitted falsified materials, I will hold you and your client in contempt." Karen didn't look so smug leaving that courtroom. 2 days later, Teely showed up to court looking like a man who hadn't slept. His tie was crooked. His usual smug cadence was gone. He stood before the judge and declared that the HOA was withdrawing the boundary map as submitted due to unresolved inconsistencies in historical overlays. Translation: they got caught. The judge didn't say much. She just noted the withdrawal and then scheduled an evidentiary hearing for the following week. But the look she gave Karen, one of those slow judicial stares that says, "I'm not done with you yet," made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Nina leaned over and whispered, "Time to hit back harder." We did. See, while the map fiasco was unraveling, Nina had been digging into the identities of the 2 inspectors who'd climbed into my paddock. Their names were listed in the HOA's response brief: James Matlick and Troy Feldman. HOA Security Commission, titles made up out of nowhere, no state credentials. But Matlick rang a bell. Nina had worked a fraud case in Phoenix a few years back involving home renovation scams. She dug deeper, cross-referenced public records, court filings, even old mugshots. Bingo. James Matlick had been convicted in 2017 for impersonating a city building inspector during a foreclosure scheme. Served 18 months, got out, moved counties, and apparently reinvented himself as Director of Environmental Oversight for Sundown Pines. We brought it all to court. The next hearing wasn't supposed to be a fireworks show, but it turned into one real quick. Nina requested the judge review a matter of credibility involving the HOA's key personnel. The judge allowed it. Nina submitted Matlick's record into evidence, along with a notarized letter from the state licensing board confirming he held no inspection credentials and had been barred from related employment for 5 years. Karen didn't even flinch. She sat there, jaw tight, as Nina outlined how this man, a convicted fraud, had entered my private property under false authority without any legal right to do so. Not only was this intrusion unlawful, Nina said, but it was orchestrated by someone who the HOA either failed to vet or knowingly empowered. That reflects not just poor judgment, but systemic negligence. Teely tried to object, but the judge overruled him before he got 3 words out. "Ms. Holtz," the judge said, "are you suggesting this individual entered under HOA authorization?" Nina didn't blink. "I'm suggesting the HOA enabled and encouraged it. And we have internal emails to support that claim. Because yes, someone had sent us those too. After the manure video went public, we started getting tips. One came from a former HOA volunteer, someone Karen had bullied off the commission last year. They forwarded us a thread of emails from Karen to her board, dated a week before the inspection. In one, she wrote, "Matlick says he can handle the walkthrough if we keep it low profile. He's done this sort of thing before." We printed it, presented it, entered it into record. Karen finally broke. She stood up in court, no warning, no request to speak, and launched into a tirade about how we were smearing her reputation, how this was all a misunderstanding, how community protection requires occasional flexibility of procedure. The judge raised a hand. "Ms. Slocum, sit down, or I will have you removed." Karen sat fuming. The judge scheduled a full evidentiary hearing and stated on record that she would be considering sanctions against the HOA for reckless governance and possible civil violations related to unlawful enforcement practices. On our way out of the courtroom, a reporter caught up to us. I gave them a quote. "If you trespass on a ranch, you better be ready to meet what's on the other side of the fence. Sometimes it's just a horse. Sometimes it's the truth." A week after the courtroom blowup, I figured the HOA might finally retreat. They'd been humiliated, caught fabricating evidence, and exposed for hiring a con man as their enforcer. But Karen, she wasn't wired for retreat. She was wired for escalation. It came in the form of a printed newsletter, hand-delivered to homes around the perimeter of Red Rock Hollow. One of my neighbors, a widow named Estelle who boarded 2 of her ponies on my land, brought me a copy, folded in half and still warm from the printer. On the front, Community Expansion Proposal, a vision for a unified South border. I read it once, then again. Then I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. They were trying to rewrite the HOA charter, retroactively. The newsletter declared that, in order to foster long-term harmony with adjacent properties, the HOA would hold a vote to amend its founding bylaws to include the southern boundary as provisional territory, citing ambiguous land use patterns and common ecological concerns. In short, they wanted to vote me into their HOA. Against my will. Retroactively. Nina's voice crackled through the phone when I told her, "That's not just overreach. That's insanity in legal letterhead." I snapped photos of the newsletter and scanned it. Nina immediately drafted a cease and desist letter, which we served the HOA board via courier the next morning. But by then, the local paper had already picked it up. HOA attempts land grab via bylaw vote. Rancher fights back. The story spread faster than brush fire. Karen gave an interview trying to pass the move off as a proactive step toward environmental stewardship, but public sentiment was not on her side. Letters to the editor poured in, and online forums were flooded with outrage. HOA residents began showing up at board meetings with questions Karen couldn't answer. That's when we got a call from the county planning board. Apparently, Karen had submitted a community growth proposal to the board 3 weeks prior, buried in the paperwork pile, attempting to register a formal expansion of the HOA's boundaries. But the application included my parcel numbers. Without my signature, without my consent. That changed everything. Now it wasn't just a civil matter, it became potential fraud. The planning board opened an investigation. We sent over our video, the forged map, the court transcripts, and the emails. They sent a formal inquiry to the HOA demanding all documentation regarding expansion plans, member votes, and community notices. And here's where it got delicious. The board's own secretary, a jittery guy named Dean Whitley, cracked. He emailed Nina anonymously at first, then met with her in person, flanked by his own attorney. Dean explained that he had been pressured by Karen to sign off on the boundary proposal under the promise that no one would look too closely. But now that the county was involved, he didn't want to go down with the ship. He handed over original drafts of the expansion documents, the ones he was told to shred, and audio recordings of Karen telling the board, "We need that land. He's one man with a pasture. We're a community." We filed the new evidence with the courts the same afternoon. Nina requested an emergency injunction to block any further HOA expansion activity pending criminal review. The judge approved it within the hour. Karen's house of cards was finally buckling. By the weekend, HOA residents were calling for her resignation. Yard signs started popping up along the subdivision fence. "Not in our name." "We love our horses, not your lawyers." "Slocum must go." It was beautiful. Like watching weeds burn after a long winter. The courtroom was packed. Not just the usual reporters and HOA diehards. This time, local ranchers, property owners, even a few school kids on a civics trip filled the benches. Apparently, watching a community president try to argue her way out of a manure-soaked disaster had become a kind of regional entertainment. I wore my cleanest boots and a collared shirt. Nina wore war paint in the shape of a steel gray suit. Karen wore white, the kind of white that screams, "I'm innocent," even when you're carrying the smoking gun. The judge wasted no time. Today's proceedings are to assess the validity of the HOA's actions concerning their attempted boundary expansion, the conduct of their officers, and the credibility of submitted documentation. Teely stood and tried to posture, but every sentence he spoke sounded hollow. The man had been backed into a corner with nothing but bad paperwork and worse PR. Nina let him dig his hole for a good 5 minutes before she stood, and then she buried them. She laid out the timeline, the forged map, the illegal inspection, the criminal record of Matlick, the internal emails, the fake expansion vote, and finally, Dean Whitley's full testimony, played from a recording that echoed across the silent courtroom like thunder. Karen's voice unmistakable. If we control the perception, we control the boundary. No one cares what the actual documents say. People believe what they see in newsletters." The judge didn't blink. "Is that your voice, Ms. Slocum?" Karen stood slowly. "Context matters," she said. "It does," the judge replied, "and the context here is deeply troubling." Teely tried to object, tried to blame rogue elements on the board, but Nina pounced. "Your Honor, every piece of evidence points to a central figure, Karen Slocum. She directed the fabrication, pressured subordinates, and authorized illegal action on private land. This is not rogue behavior. This is a coordinated abuse of power," the judge agreed. She ruled in our favor across the board. The forged documents were declared fraudulent and struck from record. The attempted expansion was declared illegal. A permanent injunction was issued barring HOA Sundown Pines from any present or future claims over my land. But it didn't stop there. The judge sanctioned the HOA for malicious legal action and abuse of process. She referred the forged boundary documents to the district attorney's office for criminal review, and she ordered Karen Slocum to appear at a contempt hearing the following week. Then came the cherry on top, the damages. $180,000, the judge ruled, to be paid by the HOA to Mr. Taylor for legal fees, reputational harm, and unlawful trespass. Additionally, a formal letter of apology, signed by the acting board, must be submitted to county record and delivered to the plaintiff. Karen didn't say a word. She just sat there, pale as gypsum, hands clenched in her lap. Nina and I walked out into a parking lot filled with supporters. Some applauded. Some handed me cookies. Someone had brought a homemade sign that said, "Feed hoe to the horses." I shook hands, thanked everyone, but what I really wanted was peace. Just a few acres of silence, and to never hear the phrase community buffer zone again. That night, I finally slept soundly. No headlights near the fence line, no strange SUVs loitering, no HOA drones pretending to be compliance observers. It was almost over, or so I thought. The contempt hearing for Karen was scheduled exactly 1 week after the ruling. By then, the news had traveled far beyond our dusty patch of Pinal County. Regional outlets had picked up the story. One local anchor dubbed it the Great Ranch Raid Debacle. Another called Karen the HOA Queen Without a Crown. I wasn't planning to attend the hearing. Nina didn't need me there. It was more of a formality. But that morning, something made me drive down to the courthouse anyway. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the part of me that had spent a year being quietly harassed and wanted to see the end of it with my own eyes. Karen arrived late. She wore beige this time, her hair tied too tight, her face drawn and twitchy. Her attorney, not Teely, who'd suddenly taken a leave of absence, looked like a man who regretted every career decision that had led to that courtroom. The judge was in no mood. "Miss Slocum," she said, "you were warned about behavior in this courtroom. You were found responsible for submitting fraudulent materials and directing unauthorized actions. Your reaction to this court's authority has ranged from dismissive to hostile." Karen opened her mouth, and for a moment I thought she'd finally apologize. Instead, she snapped. "These backwoods people don't understand community," she hissed. "They cling to dirt and animals like it's still the Wild West. I was trying to modernize this place." Silence fell like a dropped anvil. The judge didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned to the bailiff and said, "Remand the defendant into custody for contempt. Set a separate hearing for criminal charges related to the fraudulent filings." And just like that, Karen Slocum, president of Sundown Pines, self-declared guardian of order, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. I left before the news vans could swarm. I didn't need another quote in the paper. My land was quiet again. That was all I wanted. But the story didn't end there. The HOA board imploded. After Karen's arrest, several members resigned within 48 hours. Dean Whitley, the secretary who'd come forward, was named interim president and immediately suspended all HOA enforcement activity pending review. Then came the fallout inside. Turns out the fake expansion proposal had never been officially approved by vote. Karen had forged the majority signatures. Dean confirmed it, then handed over the audit logs. The county DA opened a full-scale investigation into HOA governance fraud. Dean cut a deal. He cooperated, handed over every email, and named the other board member who had helped Karen doctor the land maps. That guy, a former title officer named Lowell Berkner, had a side hustle producing expedited plats for developers. He pled guilty within a week. 2 months later, Karen was officially charged with 3 felonies: filing false public records, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and criminal trespass under color of authority. She was sentenced to 10 years. 10 years. I didn't smile at the verdict. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired, glad it was over. In the months that followed, things settled. Nina and I spoke less frequently, though I did send her a bottle of Wyoming whiskey with a note that read, "For services rendered with extreme prejudice." Dean asked if I wanted a formal apology ceremony. I declined. But I did accept the letter, hand-signed by the entire HOA board and filed with the county, admitting to everything and affirming that Red Rock Hollow was forever outside their jurisdiction. And then I got back to work. Red Rock Hollow expanded that spring. I opened a small writing center for veterans and kids from nearby towns, taught them how to care for Mustangs, how to listen to animals, how to build trust without saying a word. One afternoon, I watched a 6-year-old girl brush Rush's mane while her dad, a Navy vet with scars behind his eyes, smiled for the first time in probably months. That's when I realized you don't have to fight every battle forever, just the ones that matter, and some fences. They exist for a reason.